Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Want to welcome you here for this event on Spectrum and U.S. national security. I'm Matt Pearl, Director of the Strategic Technologies Program here at CSIS. And we have an incredible group of experts convened here today, so I'll keep my remarks short. But I will say a few things. So this event is about spectrum policy, but it's really rooted in national security and AI. We are in an AI race with the People's Republic of China. And the stakes in that race could not possibly be higher. The nation that controls and prevails in AI is going to have extraordinary economic and national security advantages and enduring ones. And that will shape the balance of power globally for decades to come. Those of us in the national security community, like me, understand that if we lose the AI race, in some sense, nothing else that we do matters from a national security perspective. And up until now, the focus of policy world in DC in the AI race has been on a number of important components. There's data centers, there's chips, there's energy, there's access to data, there's talent. All those have received attention to varying degrees, and they're all very important. But I think the next front in this race that we can't ignore is at the edge. Edge networks and edge connectivity. That's where AI systems are going to interact with the physical world, with billions of devices, with autonomous systems. That's where inferencing is going to occur. And that's what's really going to connect a lot of those other elements I was talking about, right? Energy efficiency. If you have workloads at the edge, you can be much more energy efficient. In order for the cloud to actually reach the talent to deploy these things and innovate on all these devices, you're going to need wireless networks. And so it's going to be a core enabler from AI, and that's from industrial robots to drones to precision agriculture to connected vehicles. And it's all going to depend on fast, low latency wireless connectivity. And that simply cannot happen without access to new large blocks of mid-band spectrum. Spectrum's the lifeblood of those networks. And so this is not just the purpose of the convening here, in part, is that spectrum policy is not just a commercial issue, it's fundamentally a national security imperative. The nation that connects its edge devices most effectively using spectrum and wireless networks is going to have a pivotal advantage in the AI race. And the good news is that in the United States right now, we have real momentum. Most importantly, we have guidance from Congress in the One Big Beautiful Bill. They mandated that the federal government make available 800 megahertz, at least 800 megahertz of spectrum, including at least 500 megahertz of federal spectrum. We also have incredible people working on this. We have leadership from the White House, from FCC Chairman Carr, from NTIA Administrator Ariel Roth. They have a lot of expertise on these issues. I've known all of them for quite a long time. They also have senior advisors, some of whom we're going to be talking to, who really have a lot of expertise. And they also have incredible staffs from the top to the bottom of the agencies to implement this. So I think that we're sort of in some sense in pole position, but at the same time, it's really going to depend on successful execution. And we're going to need to overcome political and technical challenges. And I would not underestimate how many political and technical challenges there will be. Those of us who have worked on spectrum know that these are oftentimes challenging issues. And so it's really going to depend on the ability of government leaders, the folks at these agencies, folks in industry and academia to work together in order to make sure that we make this spectrum available quickly and efficiently. And so today's conversation is partly about how we make that happen, and it's partly about how we ensure that spectrum is seen as a strategic pillar in our national security and AI strategy. So with that, I'll introduce our first panel, which I'm going to moderate. And these are folks who are on the front lines of working through these issues. We have Brooke Donilon, who's Chief of Staff at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA. I know we have some folks from the national security community who aren't as familiar with these issues. So I would say like NTIA is like the most important agency that you've never heard of for those people working through these issues. And then we also have Arpan Sura, who's senior counsel to FCC Chair Brendan Carr. FCC, of course, plays an absolutely pivotal role as well on these spectrum issues, particularly non-federal workers and non-federal spectrum, and also working through these issues with NTIA and the White House and the interagency. We also have Julia McHenry, who's Senior Vice President for Public Policy at AT&T, and is also like one of the best economists in the wireless business, and so we're very lucky to have her. And we also have Umair Javed, who's General Counsel and Senior Vice President at CTIA, and who has incredible experience on these issues. So with that, we're going to dive right in. Great. Can folks hear me? Is this working? Okay, great. So as I mentioned, we're here today because it's critical for the U.S. to prevail over the PRC in terms of wireless technology and ultimately AI. And so spectrum is one of the decisive levers. So I was hoping that folks could provide some context on what would it mean for the PRC to prevail in 5 or 7 years in wireless technology? What are the implications of that from your perspective?
Sure, thanks, Matt, and morning, everyone. Great to be here. Great to share the stage with Brooke, Arpan, and Julia as well. Matt, I think you got it exactly right in your introduction. I think it's really simple. If we fail on spectrum, we fail on AI. That's what's at stake. We know that AI is going to be the foundation of our future competitiveness. We see that across every sector of the industry. Right now, everyone wants to be first, to use that AI to lead in the next generation of manufacturing, of transportation, of healthcare, and so much more. And the United States and China are going to be running side by side in that race. And the outcome is going to determine which values, whether it's authoritarian or whether it's democratic dynamism, gets reflected in that technology. And so this is really important. The outcome is going to have consequences for generations. What stands out to me when we look across the economy is that right now, commercial wireless networks are viewed as the platform for AI use cases. And there was a recent survey commissioned by Dell that found that 83% of executives are finding that AI is already increasing their 5G connectivity needs. And that's not a surprise. The problem, though, is that Accenture found that we're not going to be able to meet 1/3 of AI traffic during peak hours unless we have more licensed spectrum to support that demand. That's a bottleneck. That means that we have a bottleneck in the system, and that's a real problem. It's going to stop us from realizing AI use cases. It's going to stop us from benefiting from them. And it's the same dynamic that we see in the energy sector as well. And just like AI needs more energy, AI needs more spectrum for 5G and 6G as well. So for us, that's what's at stake. The good news is that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act now provides a path to win on spectrum and to win on artificial intelligence. And so for us, what's really important is that we get to work on successful implementation of those provisions.
So, can I just kind of dig a little bit deeper to kind of put some support behind that thesis? Because I think, so obviously spectrum is key for mobile wireless networks, but it's more than just we need the spectrum. It's if we lose this race, we put ourselves at a huge disadvantage with respect to the ecosystem. And once we have that disadvantage, there's no coming back, right? And then it's clawing back is really hard. So a big piece of this is economies of scale. I mean, this is, for us to build a network, we need cost-effective equipment. For us to build a network and offer wireless at cost-effective rates where we can truly leverage AI, right? Have just the quantity of spectrum we need, the quantity of wireless capacity we need to build a network. And we cannot build a network if we are, if we don't have the economies of scale that you get from leading the world in terms of spectrum capacity and ecosystem. And without the spectrum, we can't build the ecosystem and the harmonized spectrum. I think then, of course, you also see once you get kind of behind in that, then you're no longer the place where everybody is building on top, is leveraging and building on top of their services. You see increasing amounts of the sort of the pieces of the economy that build off of wireless and AI are no longer being built here. So that puts us at an increasing disadvantage. And you see what winning the race did with respect to 3G, LTE, 5G. But if we start losing the race, then it's very difficult to claw back. And then, of course, there's the national security risk of, the more, even if we don't have Chinese equipment in our network, the more it proliferates around the world, the harder it is to be on offense. And of course, then it becomes harder and harder to secure our own networks. So,
Chairman Carr and Administrator Roth have also been very clear-eyed about the challenge from the PRC. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how FCC or NTIA are thinking about this.
The geopolitical threat from China is undeniable, and it's not just because spectrum is a platform, as Julia and Umair said. You can see it revealed in the PRC's own behavior, whether it's the promotion of Huawei in Latin America and Africa, whether it's cyber events that have threatened our network, whether it's their demonstrated interest in finding openings in our equipment authorization process. You can see it in their behavior at the WRC. You can see it at in their behavior at 3GPP, and so in my mind that provides the clearest evidence that spectrum is geopolitically significant, and it's important that this administration look at it that way, and I think that we are. At the beginning of this year, we were in what the chairman had called a spectrum malaise. We didn't have auction authority, which had been expired since the spring of 23. We've been going round and round on certain band studies. Others were years away. And there was no political commitment to release a single megahertz of federal spectrum for commercial use. And you fast forward to today, we have the one big beautiful bill that has established a real spectrum pipeline. You have, great collaboration from the White House to NTIA. People are very clear-eyed about, the stakes, and there's political alignment, and, there's a real sort of energy to execute. And so, at least from where I sit, I see a lot of room for optimism. And, for the first time in a while, I think a real plan to sort of achieve our economic and national security interests when it comes to spectrum.
So I think turning to that, because we've all sort of seen the relationship between FCC and NTIA over the years, right? Sometimes better, sometimes worse, sometimes coordination works well, sometimes it doesn't. It's been pretty clear that you all are coordinating incredibly well. And oftentimes, when I see you speak, it's almost like you're singing from the same sheet of music. But would be really interested in how you're thinking about that coordination and making sure that as we confront some of these challenging issues, and of course, on the federal side with spectrum we're making available, there are absolutely essential operations that we need to keep functioning for our national security, while at the same time working it through so that we can have commercial spectrum. So how are you working with each other and the agencies in the White House to make sure that it's a successful process?
Well, thank you, Matt, for having me. And I think I'm going to change my title on my business card to Chief of Staff to the most important agency you've never heard of. So really appreciate that. I would say coordination is going really well during the government shutdown. NTIA runs a process called IRAC, and before the FCC publishes rulemakings on spectrum, it's gone through an interagency process to make sure everyone is being considered. We are continuing that process even during the government shutdown. I know C-band is very important to the chairman, and so we are, moving quickly on that. Other bands as well. Also during the shutdown, NTIA has been working on band study plans for 2.7 and 4.4 so that we can quickly have those out the door when the government reopens. So I would say we are all singing on the same song sheet. We all understand the problems ahead and are working together.
Anything to add from the FCC perspective?
Well, I mean, the clearest sign that we're working off the same sheet is that we have legislation that tells us what to do, and that helps a lot. There's no ambiguity about what our assignments are.
Great, and I'd love to get Julia and Umair's perspective on what we need to do. Julia was chief economist of NTIA as well as chief of the Office of Economics and Analytics at the FCC. Umair at one point had Arpan's job. And so they've seen things go well and not go well, and how do we ensure that both the FCC, NTIA, and all the agencies as well as industry work this process through successfully?
Well, so I'll try to be quick. So I think the most important thing is open communication at all stages, right? I mean, so I will say one of the most remarkable things about being, and I've been at both NTIA and the FCC, but it is amazing how little industry understands what's actually happening in the agencies and how little the agencies truly understand the needs of industry, and it goes on both sides. And so we really need to keep that communication often and early. But of course, it's a challenging communication because we all have our own missions that we have to protect, and of course, their national security we have to protect as well. So I think really using the processes that we've established and have gotten better at using in terms of being able to open up just enough information so we can figure out how to make networks work and how those band studies can be done quickly. I think that's key. I think also with respect to the FCC, when it comes to assigning this spectrum, project management is essential, right? Like I just don't think everybody who's been at the FCC nods, right? It's project management is almost a religion for the auctions division, and it's because you cannot get from the conception and ideation phase of how do we have the right rules for the band, right? To how do we auction, and every auction is unique. Every auction has to create slightly different incentives and work around different impediments. So really project management.
Yes, and I would say the FCC is clearly doing an incredible job at that so far. Getting that C-band item out during the government shutdown. Obviously, they have a handful of auction staff that are working on it, but churning that out just is a huge success. And having been at the agency, I can say not an easy feat.
Yeah, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. It's a very aggressive timeline. We have to propose rules, adopt rules, finalize auction procedures, begin an auction, and finish an auction in under 2 years. And in some bands, it's taken like close to a decade. But we're happy and with the legislation, and we're up to the challenge, and we have good partners in the federal agencies that have been very supportive so far, and their continued collaboration will be essential to get it done on time.
The good news is it's doable, and we're going to do it in 2 years. No, I love that answer, and actually learned a lot of that from Julia when I was at the FCC. I think it's exactly right. I think, look, the biggest lesson I think for the FCC and NTIA, from my perspective, the message I want to send is simply we need action now. I think we spent many years marveling at the problem. We've set up new bureaucracies, we set up new processes, and I think now it's time for action, for actually moving. Those things were all important, don't get me wrong, we needed to do that. But our ambition has to be bigger than just managing our government. Our ambition has to be leading the world, and that takes action, and that's what we need to do now. I think the place for us to focus most immediately is something a little bureaucratic. It's spectrum studies, and there's 2 dimensions to it that I really want to kind of highlight. And the first dimension is that right now, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act says we've got to do spectrum studies before we do spectrum auctions, and that makes a lot of sense. But it can take over a year just to get a spectrum study started. In an era when we're talking about US leadership of racing to AI, taking a year just to start a study that the law requires us to do and that everyone agrees we should do just seems a little ridiculous. It seems like we need to look under the hood on that and really see, is that right? Do we really need to take a year before we even start putting pen to paper, or can we accelerate that process? The second dimension is how are we doing these spectrum studies? For the past few years, we've had this trend where we've allowed federal incumbents, people who have a vested interest in the outcome of spectrum studies, to control the inputs and outputs of those studies as well with NTIA. And there's good reason to have federal stakeholders part of the process. That's absolutely right. But I think responsibility requires us to at least make eye contact with the idea that this creates a possible conflict of interest. In any other discipline, we would do that, right? In any other scientific discipline, in business, in politics, we would all acknowledge that, yeah, there could be a conflict of interest in this structure. We don't when it comes to the way we do spectrum studies. We just ignore it. I think that's wrong. I think we have to make eye contact with that. We have to make sure that these spectrum studies are done in a way that's evidence-based, that instills trust in those outcomes, and that actually gets to results. And if you look at the past few spectrum studies, the outcomes have all been the same. The outcome of every single one where we've done this process has been, well, we need more study. We're not done yet, right? They haven't actually produced actionable results. And so the question I have is that what we're going to do again? Are we going to try that again, or are we going to do something different this time? And that's what I hope the agencies will focus on.
So Umair brings up a good point. And those of us who are grizzled spectrum veterans who've been doing this for like 15 years have seen a variety of approaches, right? There are quick studies like was done in 3450 to 3550. There are longer studies. There are studies that are controlled by NTIA and done by NTIA versus done by the agencies. And so here's where I put Brooke on the spot. But without getting into sort of the nitty-gritty of those details, as you do this, like what are the guiding principles that you have in making sure that you balance those equities and are successful?
Yeah, I think anyone who knows Administrator Roth knows it's not going to take a year for her to do a study, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. You know, a lot of what we do on the studies is driven by legislation that's set forth the Spectrum Relocation Fund, and there's requirements. There is bureaucracy. I agree with you. There are requirements we have to take in order for federal agencies to get the funding they need to study the operational impacts of relocating off the band. That is something that I've become very familiar with as I've been pushing our team to look at 2.7 and 4.4. 7 was done under the last administration. We immediately had money when we came in under this administration to look at 7. But the other bands have a lot more work to do. And I will say, you know, to your point, on this incentive issue, that's what we're really trying to change. I think, you know, we had a spectrum symposium earlier this year where Administrator Roth talked about don't make it a zero-sum game. Show everyone that there's a win-win opportunity here. And we've really got a lot of progress on that. You know, FAA is really leaning in on the bands that they're in, viewing it as an opportunity for upgrades. It doesn't always have to be this is what you're going to lose. If you focus on this is what you can gain, I will say we've seen a real shift in attitudes towards federal agencies. I think to Arpan's point, it is largely because of the strong leadership from the president, from Congress saying you must do this. But people are rolling up their sleeves, and we are very excited about the plans that we have, and we will do them as quickly as humanly possible.
Yeah, so your original question about, or original comment about interminable band studies, it was like, it's a very good point, and I think there was excessive proceduralism, you know, coming into 2025. You saw the excessive proceduralism in, you know, some of the requirements for band studies under the old national spectrum strategy. You saw it in some of the older BEAD requirements. You've seen it in like NEPA and siting, permitting. And, you know, one thing that we're trying to do here at the FCC is have procedures, but don't have excessive proceduralism that, you know, holds things up, because time has economic value. Every single day of delay is a day that somebody is losing money or something valuable. And as regulators, that's something we have to keep in mind when we're doing federal coordination, when we're doing band studies, when we're getting applications reviewed and cleared.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and I'd be interested in your or Brooke's perspective on that. Is it a matter of you have the leadership from the top and getting the engineers in the room and breaking through some of that process, or, you know, how do you operationalize that?
It helps to have a counterpart that agrees. That's not for nothing. I mean, that's not something that we take for granted. It's you know, but you need alignment across the entire federal government to be able to do that.
So Brooke, in terms of the One Beautiful Bill, you've mentioned some really critical bands. Be interested in how NTIA is thinking about it. Is 800 megahertz with 500 megahertz of federal, is that the maximum that will be made available? Is there the possibility of making more available? Sort of how are you thinking about what your goals are here?
Yeah, I think we definitely view it as a floor, not a ceiling. We want to make as much federal spectrum available as possible, as quickly as possible. Administrator Roth has really leaned in on the 4 gigahertz band, and we are really trying to move those studies as quickly as possible. We have 15 federal agencies in that band doing a lot of different things. And there's been very little study whatsoever. That's the bad news. The good news is we've had really great conversations with DOW, who's the largest user of the band, really great conversations with DOJ, who's the second largest user of the band. So we are moving as quickly as possible, but certainly view it as a floor. We absolutely plan to meet our mandate. Ideally early. My engineers will get very mad at me for saying that, but we want to be on time and we want to over-deliver.
So, and a similar question for Arpan. Obviously, you'll be very involved in that 500, at minimum 500 megahertz of federal spectrum. There's 300 megahertz that may come from non-federal spectrum. You talked a bit about C-band, but how are you thinking about that? What are your goals?
Yeah, so when we look at our timeline, we got to get Upper C auctioned by July of 27, and then we got to find the remaining spectrum by 2034 and auction it by then. So we're really focusing on our immediate, goals, but we're certainly taking a look at other bands, and we have an AWS-3 re-auction that we want to do soon, and so more to come on that. But our immediate focus for the time being is on Upper C because we really don't have any time to get distracted with other bands.
Great. And I turn to the industry folks as we're thinking about this. This isn't just about quantity, it's about quality, right? This is about making spectrum available in a way that's going to be most useful for industry for those AI applications we were talking about. So what are your priorities in terms of making sure we get that quality?
That's a really good question. So I will say 4 gigahertz is music to my ears. So I think we are looking for bands that we can use. Again, going back to we need bands that are harmonized and where there's an ecosystem and where there is promise of equipment that we can leverage and also leverage the network we already have. So I think we are very excited about C-band, and then that kind of obviously helps. Contiguity is a big issue, so that helps given the C-band spectrum that we already have out. I think we are looking likewise at CBRS and what can be done at CBRS to make that an effective band for carriers. And then we're looking to 4, and then moving up from there, right? So I know 7 has been studied. There's a lot of discussion about 7, and from our perspective, that is something we should be looking at. Once we look at where we are with all these other bands, it's going to be harder for us to achieve in terms of an ecosystem. It is certainly further off in terms of being able to put into our networks. And right now, is an uncertain, challenging time in the economy for everyone. And so, kind of looking at sitting on that spectrum for a while for us really doesn't make any sense. So that's our perspective.
Yeah, completely agree. I think Julia hit the critical points, right? We're looking for harmonized spectrum, so spectrum that other countries are using as well, that maximizes our scale economies, spectrum that lets us use the ecosystem that we have. And then if I would add one more thing, it's we're looking for large bandwidth, right? We're looking for those opportunities that provide for those larger blocks of contiguous spectrum, as Julia mentioned. This is important because if you look at the rest of the world and kind of circling back to where we started this conversation, the rest of the world is already thinking about their spectrum future, and they've already secured for themselves a path to a large block of contiguous mid-band spectrum for their 5G and 6G networks. We don't have an answer to that in the United States yet. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act gives us that opportunity to have that answer, and 4 gigahertz and NTIA's leadership on 4 gigahertz is very important, I think, for our industry as well. The fact that they're being ambitious in terms of how much we're going to study in that band, that creates that opportunity to match what some of the other countries are doing. 4 gigahertz is also being studied for harmonization at the next World Radio Communication Conference. So it's a really important band. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act sets out some other bands that we should be looking at. So it sets out the 7 gigahertz band. Again, this sits right next to the 6 gigahertz band, which is a really important fact. It makes that band uniquely important to the wireless industry, because that 6 gigahertz band in the United States is the entire 1200 megahertz is made available for unlicensed, which means we don't have that opportunity that other countries are pursuing to doing some mobile in that band. But that 7 gigahertz band sits right next to it. It means that we can get into that same ecosystem, that same equipment ecosystem as those other countries. And already you're seeing vendors produce radios that are straddling the 2 bands. So it gives us that opportunity that we need here in the United States. We talked about the 4 gigahertz band. The other band is 2.7 gigahertz. And again, this is one where the incentives are all lined up, like Brooke was saying earlier. It feels a lot like C-band, right? Because here is a band where the FAA acknowledges that they need to update some of their systems. They need to update their radars, and they want to do that. And they're realizing that the wireless industry can help them do that. And so we're working together on how can we make some spectrum available for the wireless industry at the same time that the FAA gets better radars, next generation radars for their operations as well. So these are all very important bands that we're focused on.
So we're running out of time, but Umair did reference international harmonization. And for folks that don't know, so the World Radio Conference is going to be in 2027. This is where virtually every country comes together and decides on these spectrum allocation issues in terms of international harmonization. Absolutely essential for economies of scale and having the U.S. be successful against the PRC. It's being hosted in Shanghai. Be an understatement to say that's not ideal. So I'd be interested very quickly in Brooke and Arpan's perspective on how NTIA, FCC, working with state and the White House are going to ensure that we're successful.
Yeah, I think we want to learn from our lessons from WRC 23. We want to go into WRC 27 with strong U.S. positions. We want to identify those positions early, and we want to build ally support so that we are very strong when we go in. We want to go in with IMT identified this go around, and I think we are working very closely with FCC, with the State Department, with the White House on establishing those positions now, so that early spring of next year, when CTELs start to really matter, we are at the table with the U.S. position.
Yeah, when I think about WRC, I think about it in terms of 4 Ps: personnel, who are going to be our leaders, we're working on that. Policies, what is the U.S. government position across all the agenda items, mostly which have focused on space. When we talk about place, the unique considerations that adhere to the event being in Shanghai from a security and operational standpoint. And then finally, partnerships, and how do we sell a vision of what we're doing to our allies abroad. And I can say that the government's focused on all 4 of those things.
Great. Well, really want to thank everyone for such a substantive discussion, particularly Brooke and Arpan, because you have such busy, demanding jobs working through these challenging, painful issues on a daily basis. And so really appreciate your time. So with that, I'm going to introduce the second panel. It's going to be moderated by Kelsey Griffiths, who covers the telecom beat at Bloomberg. We also have John Kutsin, who's a senior vice president for Spectrum at Qualcomm. Rachel Bender, who's also a senior vice president, but at Verizon working on these spectrum issues, as well as vice president, right? Sorry.
I'll take it from there.
Yeah. Will, I'm gonna tell Will that you've been promoted, and as well as Becky Tangren, who will give us that vendor perspective. She's a vice president at Nokia, one of the key companies that's based in one of our most important allies in this space. So look forward to that discussion.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here and sticking around for our second panel. We're going to be shifting focus a little bit and trying not to retread too much of the same ground, but we're going to be looking at the spectrum issues that we just discussed from the federal perspective, a little bit more from the commercial wireless side. So I'm looking forward to getting into all of this with you. I want to start off by laying some really basic groundwork for this discussion. This is maybe taking a step back even from the beginning, but I think it is important, especially as we get so in the weeds on spectrum issues. I think it's important to take a step back and remember, like, what is wireless spectrum and why does it matter, especially from a layman's perspective. So I wonder if you all could help us just lay that groundwork.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, Again, Becky Tankren from Nokia. We make wireless equipment along with lots of other telecom equipment. And I like to think of spectrum as this invisible rainbow, and different parts, if you're thinking of it like a rainbow, like different colors of the rainbow, different parts of the spectrum are more conducive to different types of communication. So today, you're hearing about lots of different bands, and they're mainly in the mid-band, and the reason why those are so important is because mid-band spectrum has great, what we call propagation characteristics that essentially enables communication to travel far and at high speed, but around things like buildings and trees, and when you get to, for example, higher frequencies, you go up higher on the rainbow, you can't travel as far, and you have more problems with getting through things like that. So that's kind of the, I guess, layman's term, and hopefully I didn't screw it up too much because I see some engineers in the room, but what spectrum is from a social perspective, it's connectivity. It allows people and businesses to connect and be part of a global economy. And that's why it's so important, because it furthers not only our economy, but also social goals. And I think we'll probably talk about some of those things as we go further on.
Great. And I want to give you both a chance to answer that, but also to answer the second part of this question, which is, why is spectrum management important? Why are we even talking about this as if it's a scarce resource?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks to CSIS for having Qualcomm on the panel. It's a pleasure to be here. So what is spectrum? Spectrum is a unique, invisible natural resource that there's really no great analog, but one way of looking at it is kind of like a roadway. And for purposes of today's discussion, it's important to note that every successive mobile technology generation uses channels or lanes on a highway that are a lot wider than the prior generation. 4G used channels between 5 and 20 megahertz wide. 5G uses channels up to 100 megahertz wide. 6G is being designed to operate in channels between 200 to 400 megahertz wide. Why is that important? It's important because it really limits where you're going to look for spectrum to open up for the next generation of mobile connectivity. So the bands in the One Big Beautiful Bill do that. They identify blocks of spectrum that are very wide. And those bands are critically important to be open for mobile spectrum. Another important thing is, it's not like we're going to open up the spectrum in the One Big Beautiful Bill and be done. This is an ongoing process, and once the spectrum is open for initial deployments for 6G, we're going to need to start to look for the next set of bands that we're going to be operating for the second stage of 6G technology. So from our perspective, all of the bands in the One Big Beautiful Bill need to be studied. The US needs to open up a minimum of 600 megahertz of spectrum in 2029 so that the United States can keep pace with the rest of the world. As Umair noted on the first panel, China, the European Union, and India will deploy 6G technology in the upper 6 gigahertz band. Right now, as we're sitting here, the US does not know where it's going to be deploying 6G technology. A lot of work needs to happen. Industry needs to be involved early, And that's kind of how we're going to get there, because it's going to be a pretty big challenge.
Yeah, I love all of the analogies that we've heard so far. And Matt said earlier, spectrum is the lifeblood of wireless. So that's the one I often like to use. It's sort of fundamental infrastructure for the digital economy. And 6G, which is the next generation of that technology, is going to require sound spectrum policy to enable all of that. And I think, to John's point, we're thinking about really big blocks of spectrum. Our CTO is also talking about 200 or 400 megahertz blocks of spectrum that we're going to need for 6G. And so we need to be ready for all the things that's going to enable. We talked on the last panel about AI, for instance. And so you need the spectrum policy to support the needs of next-gen technology and all of the use cases it's going to bring.
Absolutely. So while I have all three of you on stage together, I'm curious to talk a little bit about the relationship between carriers and equipment makers and vendors. As we're talking about bands that might become available for commercial wireless service, how does that trickle down into your work, and how do you make sure that those dominoes are falling into place so that the bands can be included in consumer equipment going forward and so that carriers can ultimately deploy it?
I'm happy to start from the vendor perspective. So Nokia is a global company, so we are looking to make equipment that can be used worldwide. And as we've heard, that's not necessarily always an easy path, because different countries have identified different portions of spectrum for different use cases. And we've talked about the 6 gigahertz band. Most countries worldwide have either identified or looking to identify that for licensed full power use, compared to in the US, where we've made the decision for unlicensed Wi-Fi in that band. But we do make radios that straddle the bands, like Umair said. So here in the US, we are talking to all of the carriers. Rachel and I will be talking on Friday, and we want to understand where the carriers are hoping to go from a use case perspective, which bands that they are targeting, and then we will listen to our customers and try to make the equipment accordingly. And then, of course, we also have to wait for FCC rules and little things like that.
Yeah, I think Becky did a great job, and all I'll say is we talk often. It's a multi-year process. Standards play a very important role. The bands don't have to line up perfectly like Becky just laid out. The upper 6 gigahertz band and the 7 gigahertz band can be supported in the same equipment, but it's something that takes time and design effort, planning. Another very important piece is that the technical requirements are aligned. What we're talking about here today is the opening of full power mobile operations, not medium power, not having unlicensed sharing underneath. Full power mobile operations are critically important. The majority of mobile connections either begin or end indoors. So indoor deployment, indoor coverage and connectivity is critically important. So that's another very important piece, that the technical requirements line up so that the bands could be used to their fullest extent.
Yeah, and I think from the carrier perspective, it's all about partnership. We learn from each other. Our engineers talk all the time. Even on the regulatory side, we talk all the time. We look at what is the ideal. What would we like to see for 6G? What are the goals? What do we think is going to come from this new technology? And then what is the reality of what the FCC and NTIA can do to free up the spectrum resources so that we can enable that? So there's so many steps along the way, and we have to continue evolving and working together to make sure that at the end, whatever spectrum does come out for full power licensed use, we're ready to go with the equipment and to build out the network.
Well, we've been circling around the one big beautiful bill requirements a lot, so I do want to bring that up again. This is obviously providing a lot of structure right now for the conversation around where we're going next with spectrum in the US. And We have now seen that the FCC put the upper C-band study on its docket for the November meeting. And this is the one requirement that was explicit in the statute, that this band be freed up for commercial wireless use. So I'd love to hear from you all ahead of the meeting. What do you think of the contents of the item? What do you think are going to be some of the big pain points as this discussion goes forward? And what would you like to see maybe fixed or tweaked as that discussion goes forward to a final order?
Sure. Okay, we'll start on this side this time. So the One Big Beautiful Act requires the FCC to auction at least 100 megahertz of spectrum from upper C-band. That's the floor, but we think that they can go much higher than that. So the draft NPRM asks about up to 180 megahertz of spectrum. We think that should be the goal, right? How much of the band can we clear in an appropriate timeline to make sure we get to mobile deployment? We think, the FCC is doing really great work in moving as quickly as possible. You heard Arpan talk about that 2-year timeline. That's an added challenge this time that they didn't have before, getting all of those steps done to finish the auction by middle of 2027. But then after that, we have to add on the layer of when do we get to mobile deployment. So the auction finishing is just part of that. You still have the transition of the incumbent services, FSS, and the Earth Station customers in that band. And then we have this added layer of the altimeter community, the aviation community, doing a once-in-a-generation altimeter upgrade. And so trying to line up all of those timelines so that we get to mobile deployment in a reasonable amount of time. We can't wait a decade after the auction to get access to the spectrum. So the FCC is, we heard, working closely with NTIA and the FAA and all of the stakeholders to make sure all of those challenges come together in an order that makes sense.
I don't think that there's much to add. Rachel covered it beautifully, but I will say we fully support the opening of the band, and we keep hearing we need wider channel bandwidths, contiguous spectrum. This offers that opportunity, and I will say one piece of good news is that I think that the FCC and FAA and all the other stakeholders have started discussing this much sooner in the process than what happened with lower C-band.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that. I do think what Becky just noted is critically important. A lot of the learnings from opening the lower C-band are now being used to accelerate that, and we need to learn from that. It's exactly what was covered on the prior panel. What works? What works is having industry work directly with the government stakeholders, the FCC and NTIA now on not just upper C-band, but 4 gigahertz, 7 gigahertz. All of these bands needs to have industry involvement very early because that's how you get to viable solutions. And we're also talking about the opening up of spectrum in the upper C-band, which is likely going to be a 5G band if it actually gets opened before 2029. Critically important that these other bands that are being studied are ready for deployment later this decade. The time frames that are laid out for transition in the upper C-band, the time frames to open up the bands in the One Big Beautiful Bill of 2033 and 2034 are problematic. Those bands need to be opened up for mobile deployments later this decade so that the U.S. can keep pace with the rest of the world.
Well, I want to pull on that thread a little bit more. I think that obviously there is a lot more runway, and that is, even built into the bill. A lot more spectrum needs to go out the door. But we're still talking about a limited resource. A lot of these bands are already being used for different purposes. Can we talk a little bit about the trade-offs of bringing some of these bands that are already into use for other purposes into the conversation, especially if we're talking about a band like CBRS that has some unlicensed traffic in it, that supports Wi-Fi and some consumer applications. What are, I guess, maybe some of the pain points that will have to be navigated there, and what do you lose potentially in that trade-off if you do bring some of those bands into the conversation?
Sure. So on the federal side, we heard Brooke talk about the federal agencies really leaning in. It helps to have legislation that's pushing you towards that, but having that collaboration among the agencies and NTIA and the FCC to identify that 500 megahertz of federal spectrum. And then on the non-federal side, to your point, we hope upper C-band will go a long way towards meeting the 300 megahertz the FCC has to find for commercial use, but there's going to need to be other bands that are part of that conversation. CBRS is certainly one of them, because then you can create a full power 3 gigahertz band. It's prime mid-band spectrum that would go from the ambit band, CBRS, C-band, upper C-band. It's potentially a huge block of spectrum, and there's a couple different ways you can do that. So in the current FCC proceeding, we've advocated for raising power levels and other rules within the existing framework. We're also open to taking a full relook at the band. But again, the goal is to get to full power licensed use so that you create those big swaths of contiguous spectrum that John and I were talking about that we're going to need for 5G Advanced and then eventually 6G.
Yeah, one of the things to just recognize is we all know the tools that can be used. And as was already noted, when you know what the possibilities are with regard to relocating incumbents, paying the incumbents from auction proceeds to improve their equipment, use less spectrum, letting the federal incumbents share amongst themselves, because there are critically important national security uses that these bands are used for. One thing to explore is, can they use less spectrum, share amongst themselves, maybe not with the public, and move them to less spectrum, move them out of the bands. But right now, what makes it very challenging is all of these bands we're talking about are being used, but they can be used much more efficiently. And all of the options need to be put on the table. But the past desire to move incumbents out of the band to give a free and clear band for full power mobile is getting very challenging, but it is important to consider the ability of upgrades to equipment using less spectrum. Relocation is another very important piece, but like Rachel said, the end goal is full power mobile, where the mobile operators need the spectrum, and the majority is in the major metropolitan areas. If there are federal incumbents that are operating, in rural regions, it may be possible to, geographically protect them. But the important thing is that we all work together now to figure out what those options are, because all of us know the solutions, and we could, that's the best approach, is to put everything on the table.
I would also add that advancements in 5G and 6G technologies can also benefit the federal agencies and benefit national security, because we see that our defense sector is more and more relying on commercial technologies. Nokia actually has an entire line of business dedicated to this called Nokia Federal Solutions. One of the cornerstone technologies of 6G, the integrated sensing and communications, which is essentially putting sensors into the wireless communications network, and you can sense things like drones or people or vehicles, and you can, I'm sure, envision the national security benefits that could come along with that, which would also offer consumer benefits.
So pulling on the national security thread there, the Senate has already passed its version of next year's Defense Authorization Act. And part of the way that version, I guess, is organized is it would narrow the scope of spectrum that's available for repurposing as the FCC and NTIA work together to clear some of these channels for commercial use. Do you think that Congress is headed in the right direction with the NDAA? And is there anything that you hope the House does differently when it takes up the bill?
I'll take a first crack at that. From our perspective, all of the spectrum bands below 10 gigahertz should be explored now for full power mobile operations. If we, as many of you know, the lower 3 gigahertz band and the 7.4 to 8.4 gigahertz band are taken off the table into one big beautiful bill. Well, if we wait until 2035 to start looking at these bands. We're not going to have any chance of deploying full power mobile operations in those bands until 2040. Way too late. The right answer is to look at all these bands, because maybe the federal incumbents will learn something. Maybe they'll say, you know what? Maybe we want to open 7.8 to 8.2 and maybe, concentrate our equipment elsewhere. So by putting everything on the table is the right approach. So and that should be part of the conversation now, because that's how we're going to get to a long-term viable solution.
Yeah, and I think, those bands were carved out in the One Big Beautiful Bill, but adding another layer of veto power here through the NTIA doesn't make a lot of sense. Senator Cruz has been outspoken on that. We heard that at the NTIA symposium and other places from him about not shrinking the administration's flexibility and getting as much spectrum out there as possible. The White House put out a statement of administration policy as well, opposing that provision. So we'll see what the House does, but we think it's important to have as much flexibility as possible to meet the goals of the Pipeline Act.
And I would just add, picking up on something Umair said in the last panel, that sometimes incentives aren't always aligned. So if you give one agency the power to say no to looking at specific bands, you have to consider whether they have the same incentives. And we do have two expert agencies, NTIA and FCC, who make spectrum decisions.
Definitely. So I want to talk a little bit about the commercial side of spectrum. We've been seeing from the carriers, at least, and wireless consumers, a lot of interest in direct-to-device capabilities, where the consumer handsets can pull in satellite service directly from space to kind of fill some of these gaps in terrestrial networks. But I think that brings up an interesting conversation around flexible use terrestrial and satellite spectrum. Not very many bands are zoned for both. So I wonder if the interest in direct-to-device is changing the way that you all think about spectrum and also the way that you're building equipment these days.
Well, Nokia actually does play in the direct-to-device space, and we have a partnership with AST, and we have a long history at Nokia of providing connectivity in areas that may have been hard to reach. So we're excited and looking at all options from that perspective. But to the extent that either at WRC or domestically we're looking at how to increase satellite use, we just hope that the commission makes decisions based on sound technical guidance before just all of a sudden increasing power limits or expanding satellite use, because there are existing terrestrial uses in some of these bands.
There's a couple different ways that we're seeing direct-to-device come to fruition as consumers figure out what is the greatest impact of these services. So one is something the FCC has had for a long time, which is through the MSS, the Mobile Satellite Spectrum Rules. And so Verizon, for instance, has a partnership with Skylo, where Skylo is not using Verizon's spectrum, they're using MSS spectrum to deliver connectivity to newer Android devices. But then you have the FCC's much newer supplemental coverage from space, and that's where the sharing comes in a little bit more. And so the FCC is allowing the terrestrial providers, as long as a satellite partner has a partnership with a terrestrial provider, to use certain bands of terrestrial spectrum to fill in those coverage gaps and try to get to 100% geographic coverage. And so there we're also partnering with AST. We're hoping to use our 850 megahertz cellular spectrum to, again, close those dead spots. And you'll see that, I think, from all the carriers on that type of supplemental coverage from space usage as well. So I think the FCC has kind of gotten out in front to lay the groundwork for the regulatory frameworks that make sense. And then when you move into the international context, making sure you keep some of the guardrails that the FCC put in those rules, like keeping satellites secondary and requiring a mobile partner before you can use terrestrial bands. Those are the types of things that are going to be important to make sure that sharing makes sense, because you still have to protect the terrestrial mobile network.
Yeah, just to add to what Becky and Rachel said. So Qualcomm supports satellite connectivity, unlicensed Wi-Fi connectivity, and mobile connectivity in all of our chipsets. So there's no doubt that satellite is going to play and is playing an important role in coast-to-coast coverage. But for purposes of supporting economic activity, economic growth, there's no comparison that full power mobile operations inside and near the major metro areas is going to be critically important. That's where people are. That's where businesses operate. That's where the American worker will be moving about on her day, carrying things out. They need connectivity. And satellite connectivity is great in rural areas, in parklands and things of that nature. But mobile connectivity provided by the mobile carriers, Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T, are critically important to supporting the continued economic growth supported by and enabled by AI are going to be critically important.
Well, we've been talking a lot today about reorganizing the U.S. Spectrum environment so that we can continue the 5G benefits and make way for 6G. So it's clearly not too early to be talking about 6G. I would love to hear what you're excited about with 6G once that becomes fully realized and how you think that's going to change the consumer use cases going forward.
Yeah, so I mean, I think on the last panel you heard a lot about AI, and for us, we're thinking about AI in the network. Is 6G going to be an AI native network? And John and Becky can talk more about that, but also on the network, how is AI going to be used by consumers? And that's why it all comes back to the spectrum policy to make sure you have the resources you need to support that. Becky mentioned ISAC, also integrated sensing, and we think that's another way that 6G could kind of change the way we use the network versus how we do it today. And that's why we have to rethink how we organize and plan for those network resources.
The four biggest drivers of mobile data demands are mobile gaming, mobile video, AI, and XR. So those four types of applications are what's going to continue to drive over the next, I'd say, 5 to 10 years growth. But the one interesting thing is, as many of you are aware, there's been a lot of activity in the XR space. So the glasses, I should say the Qualcomm-powered glasses made by Meta and Oakley, the Meta Ray-Bans and the Oakley glasses, allow you to stream live content from your eyewear. And all of us will use these capabilities to basically stream your daughter's soccer game to family across town or across the country, right? And these types of applications really use almost exclusively the uplink, the connectivity from the glasses to the network. So that's going to effectively force a re-engineering of the network where the uplink demands are going to be a lot higher. AI is going to result in that as well. So the networks are going to have to be fully capable in both directions, and that's in order to enable these applications. So we're going to see, instead of the downlink heavy networks of today, 6G is going to support a much more dynamic interface where uplink and downlink and low latency connections are increasingly important.
I agree with everything that was said, and yes, 6G is going to be an AI native set of standards versus AI enabled on 5G. AI is clearly going to be a driving factor for all networks, wireless, but also we have to think about the core, and every part of the network needs to be capable of handling these demands. If you think about the way you probably use AI, it makes sense that it's uplink heavy because you're sending information up that you might want to change a video or scene recognition, things like that. Another thing I'd say about how 6G is going to drive how we need to look at our networks and spectrum. One thing that all the use cases have in common, at the outset I said spectrum's important because it enables connectivity for consumers, businesses, even like social uses. They all require very reliable connections, and this requires large bandwidth. The size of the bandwidth is just directly corresponds to how quickly the network can react. So from a consumer perspective, gaming, from enterprise, another one example might be industrial automation or monitoring industrial systems, and even from a social perspective, remote healthcare. And these are all situations where you want your network to react quickly.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I think we're at time. So I just want to thank Rachel, John, and Becky so much for joining me. I think this was a really great discussion. I learned something, and I hope you all did too. I'm going to go ahead and tee it up for our next panel. We're going to welcome Drew Fitzgerald from the Wall Street Journal up to moderate a discussion on technical developments and policy implications, looking at how emerging wireless technology is shaping innovation, industry standards, and U.S. leadership in the global technology landscape. He will be joined by Peter Linder, Mike French, and Flynn Rico Johnson. Please welcome our next panel. Thank you.
And we have a bonus member, Chris, so thank you all for joining us for this last discussion of the afternoon. Oh, thank you. Okay. So we have an extra member of the panel. Thanks for joining us for this last discussion of technological developments and the policy implications from that. I'll just briefly introduce you all so you don't have to do it yourselves. So Peter Linder, if I have this right, correct me if I'm wrong, is the head of thought leadership for the Americas at Ericsson, and you have more than 3 decades in the industry, so you've seen a thing or two. Chris Weiserick is head of spectrum policy at T-Mobile, and you've also seen a thing or two in your career. Flynn Rico Johnson, you're Director of Government Affairs for Telecom at NVIDIA, and have time in and out of the private and public sector. And Mike French, you are the founder of the Space Policy Group, and also have experience in and out of many things, including Chief of Staff at NASA. So thank you all for joining me. We've covered a lot of these topics in the previous panels, but I think we can still expand on it. And maybe, Peter, I could start with you. Based on what we know now, these standards are still in development. A lot of work is still going into this. But what type of things will we be able to do with 6G that we're not able to do now with 5G? And what are some of the policy blind spots that might need to be solved before they can be deployed into the network?
That's a very good question. I think that a little bit, if we go back and look at the previous generation, there's always been very pivotal moments. So when we were 7 years into the 3G journey, the iPhone came. And then 4G was very much driven by the iPhone. When we were 7, 8 years into the 4G journey, all of the IoT devices started to take off, becomes a little bit wider. And then for 5G, this is the first time in history we've been able to deliver over wireless what happens in wires, so fixed wireless broadband. 6G, I think that there are going to be a number of different things at 6G that are spillovers from 5G. So now with 5G coming with lower latency, we're getting with the higher uplink capabilities and so on. And then one new capability that comes with the technology for 6G is integrating sensing and communication, which essentially you can describe it as today you can connect with devices that you directly are connected. But with integrated sensing and communication, it's almost like you're integrating a radar in the same mobile beams. You can see things that are not connected. And that could be humans or animals. It could also be stuff that are connected to other networks. But then the thing that had been talked on the 2 previous panels, the fact that we're going to use AI, and it's going to be AI running on top of the network. And the fact that a lot of the devices we're talking about, probably new devices, which are more wearable style, those will be dependent on the connectivity to work. So part of the things that the job that they will do will be happening in the device, but then it'll be happening in a lot of different places in the in different clouds on the way, and connecting there, and connecting in a way that's reliable and secure that we can trust the whole time, because it's going to be more obvious when it doesn't work. That's where I would see.
It's hard to predict 6G. I don't want to we're still working through 5G, right? I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing, though, in the 5G world is fixed wireless access. And especially, I would say there's a recognition by most of us that there's a movement towards higher uplinks or more need for uplinks. Video services, people streaming from their smart glasses or from their autonomous taxi cab or from a drone or what have you, right? And video links and data link that was going up and not just necessarily all downlink. So I think we're seeing it on the wireless carrier side, we're seeing it on the network side, and that's going to be I think an area of exploration and change in the network topography over the next couple of years.
I would add that, while we're still early, we're well on our way to sort of contemplating and understanding what 6G will mean. And so for those of you who track these standards, there was a lot of interest in the OFDM waveform for the air interface. Is that sufficiently ambitious to reach our goals for 6G? And, that is one pigment within a larger display of 6G. It's a set of standards. And, from our perspective, our North Star is that we are setting standards that fully capitalize on the significant technology that we have available to us now. And so if we aren't sufficiently ambitious with our standards, we won't be capitalizing on the underlying technology, which will allow for a fully AI native 6G. And that's new and different. So we don't want to miss that moment.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess probably from the satellite perspective, I'll probably start with sort of thinking about where we are with 5G and sort of the build out there. And I think, several of the policy issues we're probably most focused on, are still looking sort of at today's usage and where perhaps there's additional room for satellite activity, or shared satellite activity or coordinated satellite activity, I think versus that's probably more of the policy stuff I think lies today.
Yeah. We'll have a lot to say about satellite connectivity, but quickly I want to go back, Chris, to fixed wireless access. That obviously has been a success, somewhat of a surprise success to many in the industry. I don't know if you'd be among them. T-Mobile has the most 5G fixed wireless access subscribers of anyone in the world. You have your competitors who are pretty close on your heels. We don't see anywhere those sort of numbers for that specific technology using the 5G standard in other countries. Is there, the physics are the same around the world. Is there a structural or a policy reason that you don't see that as common in other countries, and do you expect 6G to change that?
It's hard to opine on other countries' spectrum policies and why they do or don't have fixed wireless. I can tell you from our perspective at T-Mobile, we saw the train coming, and that's where we had our merger from 2020, and that really enabled the aggregation of large amounts of contiguous spectrum, which is necessary to provide a competitive choice for consumers. And we think we did a good job of providing an opportunity, and the marketplace seems to respond to it, right? It's competition, choice, things that we've always espounded at T-Mobile, that we think when consumers are empowered to be able to make choices and have opportunities, something from the incumbents, that they often like to be able to choose that. And so we think we provide that as fixed wireless access. We saw the train coming. We made sure to get on the tracks and harness to it, and we like that opportunity.
I think it was hard in the beginning to convince people that this train was coming, because a lot of people have been thinking about like 1G, 2G, like fixed wireless has been around since 1G, but it was always the sibling with like really poor performance and always a generation or two behind. So it's hard to people say, hey, that we would be able to leapfrog pretty much to 2 generations this time. If we look at specifically in the US, why has it been so successful here? It's a little bit, dynamics is different. We have a larger, like cable, having a different position than we see in the rest of the world. And perhaps fiber have gotten further in a lot of other markets. So there was, I think, a really interesting thing happening there, with both cable providers and the 5G providers getting to a point where it became a dual play market in essence with fixed and mobile. So I think that has contributed to it.
And Peter, you have a global perspective. Are the spectrum, the amounts of contiguous spectrum available in other countries, are there any environments that are similar to the States where that sort of market could grow, or is it really not a
well, you have one
business
market
structure?
which I think is interesting to watch is what's going on in India, since they have a very, very low penetration of wired infrastructure. Roughly 30 million has been more or less stable on that level for the last 20 years. So they're one of the engines together with the US. So if we provide the innovation and made sure that everything was vetted and worked, they're most likely the one going to drive a lot of scale out of this. That's a market. And I think when India is adding scale to it, I think a lot of other markets we're also seeing that, hey, if they can do this right now, we're doing both fixed and mobile services off the same infrastructure. Isn't that a pretty good thing, making sure that the last mile shouldn't necessarily be about digging? It could be about putting up a 100-foot tower instead and getting the job solved in that way.
Okay, I'd like to pivot a bit. Flynn, are there bottlenecks that you see, not to the technology, but to the policy, that are preventing or impeding AI technology from being pushed out into the RAN like we've seen it in other industries?
I don't know if there's the same correlation you'd see with, say, spectrum, where public policy has a huge bearing on whether or not we're able to make the necessary spectrum available. There's no analogous regime that's going to dictate whether or not compute makes it closer to the edge. And so we're starting to see that happen now. Carriers are in various stages of deploying compute, and it's already being leveraged in a positive way. So I don't know that the same, like I say, regulatory hurdles are in place that you would see in other domains of the network like spectrum, which is a good thing. That means people are innovating and these networks are changing.
And going beyond that, NVIDIA is part of, and many operators are also part of this AI RAN initiative. That brings to mind something that many people in this room have heard about for a while, which is another standard-setting effort for Open RAN. Where does the efforts that you're working on to put AI into the network and into the edge, where do they overlap and where do they depart from some of these efforts to make open standards for the RAN network over the past 5 years?
Sure. So Open RAN is a set of specifications that dictate how components within a network interact. You can build an AI RAN pursuant to Open RAN standards. So they're related but different ideas. NVIDIA is leading a coalition of American companies called AI Win. That's Nokia, ODC, MITRE, Cisco, Booz Allen, and the goal there is to have a fully American-made 6G AI native stack. At GTC, we announced a partnership with Nokia to deploy both our hardware and software into their deployments worldwide. And so we're leading both on American collaboration with allied partners, and the goal here is that we want to have a set of products and standards ready for the 6G build cycle. I mean, that's already happening. Like I say, the standards are being set. And so we're working hard to ensure we're ready to meet the moment.
Peter, I'd like to go back to, I think it was an Ericsson report that showed that under different scenarios, the forecast for mobile network traffic growth is still growing very quickly. It's decelerating. It's maybe 15% by 2030, which is huge growth rate for any other industry, but not what we've seen in past decades for the wireless industry. Will AI change those aggregate numbers?
Yeah, so I think we see a couple of different things happening. First, the growth is now happening from very, very high numbers. So even though it's 15%, is like the total capacity in the network still doubles every 5 or 6 years. We've seen a couple of things that happen. If you look at the traffic from fixed wireless, it's roughly 20 times a smartphone on a monthly traffic basis. So when you add, even though you just add 10 million of fixed wireless customers, is a significant amount of traffic. What we see as AI is perhaps that right now we're in the very beginning of the journey. We feed in text and we get text back. A little bit like if you're thinking back very, very far to the days when it was primarily text back and forth. And I gave my brother-in-law an iPod and he was annoyed because it took 30 minutes to download every song and he couldn't call their house. I think a little bit what we're seeing with AI and the traffic patterns we're going to see, that's going to change when we're moving towards multimodal things, when we're starting feeding in video, audio, and sound and getting back the same thing. And also when we're starting to getting a lot of devices that feeds in real-time data, like video sensors that capturing data and actions taking automatically. So I think we're in the very beginning of the journey. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but it's one of those step shifts. And I also believe that it's not only about the amount, but it's also how we deal with the traffic. Because so far we have been talking very much about broadband, and whenever we do prioritize some traffic, we have done it with some kind of thinking which is more like creating a diamond lane, take away a whole lane and permanently sets it up. What we're going to do going forward, we're going to see way more dynamic behaviors in the network so that the network are able to adjust to the traffic loads. A little bit more like how we all behave when we see the ambulance in the rear mirrors. We all go to the side, the ambulance gets through, and then it's back to normal. So I think we will pay more attention to other things than just the raw capacity. And there will be things like the uplink capabilities, the latency, and that each and every service gets it what it needs. And that in itself drives spectrum needs.
And Chris, maybe you could address, as those new uses come into the network, do you think that, do you have the flexibility as an operator to change those lanes, change the amount that's devoted to uplink versus downlink without major policy changes? And do those policy changes take enough time, or do they take too long to implement the changes that you're looking to make?
Well, we're very fortunate that policymakers have taken a very light touch to wireless and how it's worked. I know there was debates in net neutrality for the last couple of years and stuff like that that had some different thoughts about that. But T-Mobile is living this today. We have a program or service called T-Priority where we can prioritize traffic and customer needs so that the video streaming in the back of the Uber gets less priority than the video coming out of the Uber that's autonomous driving the kid around who's watching the video, right? You have to recognize that there's both a social goal and a business goal that getting the video feed from that Uber is more important than the recreational video in the background, right? And so, yeah, we are very fortunate we had that flexibility, and we were very proud of the fact that we're leading the charge. If anyone wants to sign up for T-Priority afterwards, let me know. But yeah, we think that we have a lot of flexibility us as operators here in the U.S. have.
Flynn, maybe you could go into a little more detail. How do you see those traffic patterns changing as AI is folded into the network?
Well, when we talk about AI in the networks, we often start with how is traffic going to change with the proliferation of AI applications, and that's an important part of how we understand the networks of the future. But what often gets lost is what will AI do for the networks themselves to ensure they have the capability to prepare for that burstier uplink traffic. And so, if you use the analogy with a large language model, in that case, you're tokenizing syntax of the English language in a way that allows for an output. Make me an itinerary in Paris for 4 days that costs under $10,000. You are tokenizing a map, you're tokenizing restaurants, language performs an output. Well, what if the tokenization of data is informed by ray tracing so we can understand dynamic propagation models, or power levels, or the distribution of my cell sites, or changes in population because a large event is happening? Could that information be used to inform real-time AI applications on the network side to ensure that they're living, breathing creatures that respond to dynamic environments around them? And so surely AI is going to change the traffic that runs over the networks, but when we deploy compute into the networks themselves, they're going to be better prepared to handle that.
And do you have a sense of where that compute will be deployed? What is the edge to NVIDIA?
Well, it changes based on, certainly you're going to have compute on device through the core. And so depending on the application, you may rely on a different component of the network, as has always been the case. So, for example, our partnership with Nokia, we have an Aerial RAN Computer Pro, our ARC Pro, that's going to fit into their AirScale base stations. We have a Siona research kit that's going to allow people with our Spark supercomputer to do 6G research at their desk. And so from the device all the way to the core, compute is going to be moving closer to where it's used. That has implications for latency and many other things, but I don't think it'll be deployed or should be conceived of as it is going to one place in the network.
And Mike, we've talked a lot about AI here and other commercial uses, but obviously spectrum isn't just used commercially. There are national security implications, there's military uses, there's other uses. We've seen that debate play out on the Hill earlier this summer. We've seen it play out years before over the radio altimeter debate. Do you think that there are any changes that could be made or maybe are being made at the interagency level to tamp these conflicts down before they burst out into the public eye?
Yeah, thanks. I think two different, maybe two different threads to that. I think the first one is when we're talking about things like looking to new spectrum as the big beautiful bill does. I think there from the national security space, from the national security community writ large, and I think the aviation community, you have a lot of scar tissue from these previous these previous discussions, right? And I think that the discussion that the last panel emphasized about coordination among all the agencies as that moves forward, including industry, is really important. Because these concerns, they're coming from a very core place in the national security community to the aviation community, right? They're coming from a place of safety and also a different view of replacement of systems. Right? There's a different view for the national security community and also the scientific community of the ability to sort of quickly pivot or more quickly pivot away from legacy systems.
Meaning it's harder. Specifically, it's harder.
It's harder. It's the financial incentives always don't work the same, right? And then in some places it just may not be feasible, right? For some of the hardware, particularly space-based hardware. So I think that's kind of one aspect of what drives some of the tension and discussion we saw in things like leading up to the big beautiful bill and now in the NDAA. I think a second aspect that we live with a lot in the space industry, and we live with this all the time, is much of what we do has some federal spectrum coordination aspect to it. And there's an interest from industry's perspective, especially now with the administration focused on how to make lessen the regulatory burden, and hearing from the NTIA and FCC leaders that we did earlier today, you can sort of hear that interest. That what we're talking to the government about is, can we have a different default position when we come forward with interagency review? There's an incentive in a lot of places for when we show up looking to use spectrum that may have federal use, for that agency to sort of instinctively say no, because there's no cost to them doing that. And so we're really interested, and we're talking to the administration about how do we change that to a default yes but, right? And on top of that, in non-classified areas where there's potential conflicts, can we have the agencies be much more transparent on let us know as industry what those conflicts are or may be, so that we can propose to them at the beginning. And so these are just a few steps that I think the administration is going to be very open to thinking about, that'll make a big difference in really the regular operations of satellite systems.
And if you can give folks a preview, if you had to predict what might be the next conflict point over spectrum over the next year, what would it be over?
In space specifically?
In spectrum writ large.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll stick with space since that's where I like to live. I love Earth the most, but I think that I don't want to say an area of conflict. I think an area of interesting discussion and hopefully a lot of thinking, including from folks on this panel, is the previous panel talked about direct to device and that how. From a satellite perspective, there's really sort of two avenues in which that's happening. One is where the satellite provider is partnering with an operator, service provider, using their spectrum, and the FCC has worked through how that's done. We also have the case where satellite provider is using their own spectrum or satellite-based spectrum. And what we're seeing, and I think the SpaceX EchoStar deal has really sort of started making people think about this, is what happens in more of a hybrid model, where it's not so clear, sort of what's the driving, spectrum, and what is that at the end of the day the business model that's driving connectivity to the end user. I think how we think about that, I think the FCC is thinking about that, and I think folks on the stage are thinking about that. And to me, I think that's probably an area where I think it develops some very interesting technology questions, policy questions, but also business questions.
Well, let's get back to the technology and the business aspect of that, Chris, because obviously T-Mobile was the first to partner with Starlink on its direct-to-device service. What has your team learned from the usage of that network and from some of the policy debates that you're seeing play out at the FCC?
I think we know that people like it, and we know that more people want it. We've recently announced we're making text to 911 available to anyone, right? Even non-T-Mobile customers. The wonders of eSIMs provides lots of opportunity in that regard. And so, yeah, it's a new thing, right? It's relatively only been launched earlier this year commercially for us. And we're getting to do it, but I think like other satellite connectivity options, it's provided lots of good opportunities for new experiences and people able to communicate in ways they were not able to do before. But also has its limits, right? I was at Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and it didn't make a difference whether I had T-Mobile service or not because there's enough tree coverage that I wasn't going to get through the tree. So it's also a learning process, and we'll continue to learn there.
And do you see both approaches working for T-Mobile potentially in the future, or own spectrum versus MSS?
Who knows what the future is, but I never predict nothing because having seen a train come, they can come. So.
Peter, I'd love your thoughts on D2D and how you see that playing out in other markets other than the U.S.
No, I think it's complement. If we look at we'll see what other technologies available. We have fiber that's propagating at a certain pace through society, and it becomes the further out you get on the grid, the harder and harder, or the more costly it is. So normally you can say if you don't see your neighbor's post box, fiber is perhaps not necessarily for you. Same thing, fixed wireless takes you very far out, but I think there was FCC did a really good report in 2017 where they predicted that the cost of closing the last percent was as high as getting from 86 to 99% coverage. So it's clearly a satellite piece there, which is you get far out where people live. And then we have 0.5 million square miles beyond where we have cell coverage today, where, wildfires take place and all of those kind of things. Satellite's perhaps the only option that you have there. So I think that it gets to a point where you can build cellular along roads and everything like that, but satellite definitely have a role to play. And then there's a lot of innovation taking place right now, how it's going to happen business model-wise. Do you use it as a primary access for some people and others more complement? So, but it's definitely a tool in the toolbox, both for fixed and mobile applications.
And Mike, I'd like to go back to, we're talking a lot about connecting to satellites from your cell phone, but obviously that's not the only thing that these networks were made for. What is the type of connectivity from space that's interesting you the most, and again, might be the subject of new rules and new regulations, not just at the national level, but at the ITU level?
Yeah, so when direct-to-device gets a lot of attention. It's exciting. There's all kinds of players in it. Some interesting. The public markets have had some excitement around them. But really, at the core of the sort of satellite technology revolution is the idea of broadband from low Earth orbit or non-geostationary orbit. And so the use cases there, when you look at kind of what I'm most excited about, is the consumer side is certainly an industry one and aviation market an industry one. I think for maybe folks in this audience, the national security aspects of what these capabilities can provide should be very important, right? And we think about where the Department of War is focused. It's on dual-use technology. It's on looking to new vendors, looking to new procurement models. The technology that's being created here essentially has some national security use inherent to it, whether on that same network in the same way we do that today with existing satellite systems, or in a separate network, for defense or national security purposes themselves. And so that side of the market's incredibly interesting to me, particularly as we start thinking through questions of sovereignty, which is obviously a hot topic in its own right.
And there is a bit of back and forth between U.S. officials and the EU over how the EU's rules on space will be developed. What's at the heart of that conversation?
Yeah, so for those not following EU law, EU space law that closely, the EU put out a draft space law in the last few months that was quite comprehensive, and the U.S. government responded not too long ago, with a fairly robust answer on its thoughts. And I'd say from an industry's perspective, I sort of categorize three big concerns. The first is really a duplicative regulatory burden put on companies. I've seen estimates that it adds anything between 3 to 30% costs. And it doesn't recognize explicitly how many of the rules that companies already have to go through would be reciprocated by the EU. The second big area is that it lays out some requirements that are probably not technically feasible, right? And so, we're not quite sure how to respond, if that's going to be a requirement for U.S. companies to go to Europe and compete. And the third, there's aspects of the EU space law that really appear to possibly be sort of non-tariff, trade barriers. And this includes sort of a preference for European-based launch, as an example. Also, the way that they frame the number of satellites that then drive certain requirements, could be seen, sort of when we're waiting to get more understanding behind this, as perhaps targeting certain companies versus targeting, thinking about actual harm.
Certain U.S. companies, such as?
Yeah, I mean, the particular case I'm thinking about there's a rule that talks about giga constellations over 1,000, which if you look at sort of the market, that would, be Starlink and Amazon Kuiper, right? And so it would certainly also be Chinese systems as well, so non-EU systems, right? And so sort of just, I think there's a lot of industry has a lot of questions, the U.S. government has a lot of questions, just to make sure, where's this coming from, right? These are new criteria that we haven't seen sort of drive safety or security rules in the past.
Okay, I think we're out of time, so there's been a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure we could go on for much longer, but I appreciate everyone coming to join us, and now I'll hand it over to Matt.
Great. And while the think tanker in me would love to spend time summarizing this rich and robust discussion, I know you all have jobs to get to and things to do. I would just offer the one observation, one of my takeaways. We talked about the criticality of making this spectrum available for commercial use, but just how much opportunity there is here for all kinds of stakeholders that are important, right? We talked about FAA and other agencies, how they can get better equipment. It's more robust to interference, right? Really important for public safety. We talked about new technologies like integrated sensing and communication, essentially turning mobile networks into radars, right? Incredibly useful if you're the Department of Defense and you're worried about drone swarms that are going to leave a shipping container in Newark, right? And we talked about, the importance of international harmonization in terms of opportunities for U.S. allies and partners, right? Things like fixed wireless. If we can have that international harmonization, it helps not only U.S. but other countries. So really, so many opportunities. There are a lot more, but just really appreciate everybody who participated in the panels as well as the audience. Really look forward to engaging with all of you on these issues. CSIS has been putting out commentaries, is going to be putting out white papers, and we really look forward to continuing the conversation with academia, industry, government in order to make sure that the U.S. is successful. So thank you.